The German officers couldn't believe what they were witnessing. As June 6, 1944 dawned, the sight before them seemed to violate everything military doctrine had taught them possible. Stretching across the English Channel toward the horizon stood an almost infinite procession of vessels, thousands and thousands of them, more than the mind could readily process. Above them, the sky itself seemed alive with noise and movement. Allied aircraft filled the air in such overwhelming numbers that they darkened the morning light. Sunday, this was emphatically not the weakened, internally fractured America that Nazi leaders had repeatedly assured them to expect. Something far more formidable stood before them now. This was raw industrial power translated into military form, a scale of capability that simply couldn't be reconciled with what German planners had assumed. 2 weeks would pass before Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German Commander-in-Chief West, would sit down and formally document what he had observed. His assessment ran to more than 3,100 words, and it didn't mince matters. Von Rundstedt identified the decisive advantage the Allies possessed with unflinching clarity: absolute control of the skies above. The numbers were staggering: 29,000 Allied sorties compressed into just 2.5 days. Every single day brought approximately 2,300 aircraft, diving and strafing anything that moved on the ground, targeting even individual soldiers. Daylight tank movements across open terrain had become a death sentence. What von Rundstedt had witnessed that June morning represented something far deeper than a single military crisis. It was the visible expression of a catastrophic miscalculation by German leadership, one that had taken root 3 years earlier. January 8th to 9th, 1942, found Adolf Hitler in his headquarters conducting one of his rambling monologues. The Führer's words were meticulously recorded by Heinrich Heim and Martin Bormann, eventually published as Hitler's Table Talk. With complete conviction, Hitler turned his thoughts toward America. He spoke with absolute certainty about what American society truly was. Everything about America's behavior, he declared, revealed a nation that was half Judaized and half Negroid. How could anyone reasonably expect such a state to remain intact? How could a nation survive where 80% of government revenue disappeared into taxation, where the entire foundation rested upon the pursuit of profit? These weren't casual remarks tossed out during conversation. This reflected the fundamental architecture of Nazi ideology, the bedrock belief system that would guide German strategic decisions and ultimately contribute to the Third Reich's defeat. Hitler had aired these opinions publicly just 1 month before. Standing in the Reichstag on December 11, 1941, as he formally declared war on the United States, he condemned what he saw as America's supposed cultural degeneracy. Any achievements America had made would appear admirable only to a Judaized mixed-race society, he proclaimed. Europe recognized these accomplishments not as proof of strength, but as symptomatic of cultural and artistic decay, the inevitable result of Jewish and Negroid blood mixing within the nation. The Nazi leadership genuinely embraced these racial theories. They weren't playing a cynical game for public consumption. These beliefs formed the actual foundation of how German leaders assessed their adversaries and evaluated their own position. Nazi propagandists had spent years working to convince both Germans and international audiences that America was in terminal decline. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, wielded his influential weekly publication, Das Reich, as a weapon to hammer this message home repeatedly. In an August 9, 1942 piece, Goebbels ridiculed America with particular contempt. Left to itself without European guidance, he wrote, America would devolve back into desert and prairie, territories as vast and empty as the spiritual void within American souls. He portrayed the nation as utterly dependent on European civilization for anything of cultural worth, described it as a youthful land conspicuously lacking in history, genuine education, and authentic culture. The propaganda minister saved his harshest attacks for American military leadership. In a June 7, 1942 article specifically titled Heroes and Film Heroes, he focused his venom on General Douglas MacArthur. Goebbels condemned MacArthur as cowardly for evacuating Bataan prior to its April 10, 1942 capitulation. He contrasted MacArthur unfavorably with German General Strummer, whose isolated unit had held its ground for 107 consecutive days. The comparison led Goebbels to his cutting conclusion. The fleeting celebrity of American film star generals would evaporate as completely as wax figures melting inside Madame Tussauds. Hermann Göring, serving as Reichsmarschall and Luftwaffe commander, embodied this widespread German contempt through his infamous declaration. Americans possessed the capacity to manufacture refrigerators and razor blades, he stated, but they would never develop the military hardware and logistical supplies required to vanquish Nazi Germany. His claim wasn't mere wartime posturing, it expressed genuine German conviction about American industrial limitations. The messaging remained remarkably consistent across Nazi propaganda channels. America's racial mixture weakened the nation fundamentally. Jewish operatives corrupted its government. A plutocratic capitalist system divided its people into warring classes. American soldiers simply lacked the martial determination that German troops possessed naturally. German newspapers published cartoons rendering President Franklin Roosevelt with grotesquely exaggerated Jewish features, insinuating he served as nothing more than a puppet controlled by international Jewish conspirators pulling invisible strings. Magazine covers presented American cities as moral wastelands where jazz, music the Nazis connected with African Americans, had supposedly poisoned culture irreparably. The storyline appealed powerfully to those predisposed to believe it. America lacked any genuine national unity, the narrative proclaimed. The nation possessed no pure racial foundation capable of inspiring collective devotion. How could a nation of such mixed background ever realistically hope to overcome the racially pure and ideologically cohesive German state? Wehrmacht officers internalized this message. The German population believed it. Even as America formally entered the conflict in December 1941, Nazi leadership maintained confidence that this allegedly soft and divided democratic system would disintegrate when confronted by the hardened military machine of the Third Reich. German military strategists had examined American military performance during the First World War and drawn conclusions that reinforced their skepticism. Certainly, America had dispatched troops to Europe in 1917 and 1918, but those soldiers required extensive preparation under French and British supervision before anyone considered them prepared for combat. The American Army of 1918 had fielded fewer than 200,000 soldiers before conscription began. Surely this indicated a nation lacking the institutional foundation necessary for contemporary mechanized conflict. Hitler himself harbored nothing but scorn for American military potential. Within his closest inner circle, he mocked the proposition that Americans could manufacture decent weaponry or assemble competent armies. He pointed to what struck him as American fixation on leisure and entertainment. What nation so absorbed by Hollywood cinema and consumer culture could possibly develop the hardened warrior spirit necessary for comprehensive total war? The Führer's fundamental worldview made room for only one possibility. His racially homogeneous dictatorship possessed inherent advantages that a multi-ethnic democracy could never match. When Hitler declared war on America on December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, he combined feelings of inevitability with undisguised contempt. In his mind, the formal declaration simply acknowledged a conflict Roosevelt had already begun covertly through Lend-Lease assistance to Britain and provocative naval operations throughout the Atlantic. But Hitler's strategic calculations were profoundly mistaken. He believed America, already fighting Japan in the Pacific theater, wouldn't be capable of mounting substantial European operations for years. During that window, he convinced himself, Germany would crush the Soviet Union and establish an impenetrable fortress Europe that no power on earth could breach. German war planners compiled comprehensive inventories of American deficiencies: military tradition, an experienced officer corps, genuine combat experience, modern armor, strategic bombing capacity. The list seemed endless. What these planners failed to comprehend was a critical distinction. America's weaknesses were temporary conditions, while its strengths were permanent structural advantages on an enormous scale. The United States possessed something Germany desperately required, yet could never acquire in sufficient quantity: raw materials and manufacturing capacity spread across a continental expanse. Throughout 1942 and continuing into 1943, Nazi leadership observed with increasing concern as intelligence reports arrived from North Africa. Inexperienced American soldiers initially stumbled through early engagements. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm German military superiority convincingly. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps unleashed a devastating assault on American forces positioned among the Tunisian mountains. The casualty statistics appeared to vindicate Nazi racial theories completely. Americans suffered 6,300 total casualties, 300 soldiers killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing or captured. German casualties totaled just 989, 201 killed, 536 wounded, 252 missing. The American equipment losses staggered the imagination. Tanks destroyed or captured numbered 183, half-tracks 104, artillery pieces 208, and trucks 512. German forces seized 57,000 gallons of gasoline and 45 tons of ammunition. Nazi propaganda departments seized on Kasserine Pass as definitive confirmation that American soldiers lacked fighting capacity. German newspapers declared that American troops panicked and fled when confronting genuine professional soldiers. Radio broadcasts questioned American military competence mercilessly. Goebbels pronounced that this represented exactly what happened when a mongrel nation attempted warfare against warriors of pure blood and unbreakable will. Yet certain experienced German officers perceived something disquieting beneath the surface triumph. Rommel himself grasped what Nazi propagandists refused to acknowledge. Inside his personal journal, he documented his observations with clinical precision. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been truly first class, he wrote. After absorbing the initial assault, they recovered with remarkable rapidity and speedily re-established the line by concentrating reserves to protect critical passes and defensive positions. Subsequently, in the published Rommel papers, he expanded this assessment even further. The American generals proved themselves remarkably sophisticated in their tactical deployment and coordination of forces, he recorded, though their most remarkable achievements in mobile warfare wouldn't emerge until we encountered them in France. The Desert Fox, one of Germany's most accomplished field commanders, had recognized something Hitler and Goebbels deliberately ignored. The Americans adapted rapidly, they extracted lessons from setbacks, and most disturbingly for German planners, an apparently inexhaustible flow of new equipment kept arriving. By May 1943, merely 3 months following Kasserine, American armies had expelled all Axis forces from North African territory. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered, bringing roughly 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops into captivity in Tunisia. Kasserine Pass's true lesson wasn't American incompetence. It demonstrated American capacity for learning. The ability to absorb defeat, rapidly reorganize, and re-enter the fight substantially stronger represented exactly the type of adaptive flexibility that rigid authoritarian structures found nearly impossible to replicate. While Nazi propaganda machines persisted in ridiculing American productive capacity, the reality taking shape on the far side of the Atlantic defied rational comprehension. The production figures proved so enormous that German intelligence officers reporting them faced accusations of exaggeration or defeatism. Yet the numbers held up under scrutiny, remained verified by multiple sources, and multiplied monthly. America produced 29,497 tanks in 1943 alone. This count didn't encompass other armored fighting vehicles. Overall armored fighting vehicle production for that single year totaled 37,198 units. For comparison, Germany manufactured 26,925 tanks during the complete war span from 1939 through 1945. In just 12 months, America built more tank units than Germany produced across 6 years of total warfare. The Sherman tank embodied the gulf between what Germans imagined and what reality delivered. German tank crews initially disparaged the Sherman as inferior to their Panzer Mark IV and the formidable Tiger. The Sherman featured thinner protective plating, carried less powerful armament, and burned more readily when struck. German tankers called it the Ronson, borrowing from a cigarette lighter brand, because it purportedly ignited on first contact. When German forces seized a Sherman designated War Daddy II from the 1st Armored Division on February 22, 1943 in Tunisia, they transported it to the Kummer's Dwarf Weapons Testing Center for comprehensive technical examination. The German technical report contradicted the dismissive chatter. The Sherman was solidly engineered, dependable and spacious inside. German engineers acknowledged its reliability, surpassed German tanks, and characterized it as an automotive marvel that German industry could only aspire to match. What German tankers didn't fully appreciate was what American mass production signified strategically. Whenever Germany finished one Tiger tank, America cranked out dozens of Shermans. Individual tank versus tank encounters do favor quality, but broader military campaigns are determined by quantity. A Tiger could eliminate 3 or 4 Shermans before succumbing itself, but if America fielded 20 Shermans for every Tiger, simple mathematics guaranteed Allied attrition advantages. German units actually prized captured Shermans for their own operations, particularly converting them into armored recovery vehicles. Recovery units operating in Italy specifically sought captured Shermans due to their remarkable durability compared to German vehicles perpetually breaking down. A war diary entry from an Africa Corps unit dated November 2, 1942, recorded that American-manufactured tanks possessed advantages over German tanks because they could effectively engage targets exceeding 1,000 meters distance. Aircraft production painted an even more dramatic picture. In 1943 alone, America produced 84,153 aircraft, encompassing 9,574 heavy bombers, 7,256 medium bombers, and 23,621 fighters. By 1944, production capacity peaked at 96,270 aircraft. This single year exceeded total Japanese aircraft production throughout their entire war, which reached 76,320 machines from 1939 through 1945. American airplane factories operated continuously, 3 shifts running around the clock, 7 days weekly without interruption. Women who had never worked in manufacturing before learned to position rivets through aluminum, install hydraulic components, and construct intricate instruments. By 1943, women represented 65% of the aircraft manufacturing workforce, compared to merely 1% before hostilities began. Rosie the Riveter became the iconic symbol representing hundreds of thousands of real women whose labor created American air supremacy. The Ford Motor Company constructed an enormous facility at Willow Run, Michigan, dedicated entirely to manufacturing B-24 Liberator bombers. The complex sprawled across 3.5 million square feet, the single largest manufacturing facility under one roof anywhere globally. When operating at capacity, Willow Run employed 42,000 people, including more than 15,000 women. The B-24 Liberator represented an extraordinarily complex piece of machinery. Its construction demanded 1,550,000 individual components, compared to roughly 15,000 parts in a typical automobile. Yet Ford's assembly line methodology, adapted for bomber production, accomplished mass manufacturing rates that military specialists had considered impossible to achieve. During peak production in 1944, Willow Run assembled one finished B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. April 1944 reached peak monthly output of 428 bombers. Total Willow Run production eventually reached 8,685 B-24s, representing approximately half of all B-24 Liberators built by all manufacturers working combined. These aircraft would hammer German industrial facilities, obliterate transportation infrastructure, and establish the aerial dominance that would make D-Day achievable. Ford employees constructing bombers at Willow Run fought the war precisely as surely as aircrews flying those same planes across European skies. The Liberty Ship program demonstrated how Americans applied mass production innovation to shipbuilding. Initial Liberty ships required 230 to 355 days for construction in 1941. Through continuous refinement of mass production techniques originated by industrialist Henry Kaiser, average build time compressed to 30 to 42 days by 1943. The record breaker SS Robert E. Peary launched in precisely 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes between keel laying on November 8 and launch on November 12, 1942. While this achievement involved substantial completion work after the vessel hit water, routine production still sustained extraordinary pace. By 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships each single day. Overall, Liberty ship construction reached 2,710 vessels between 1941 and 1945. These ships transported everything the Allied armies required to sustain combat operations. They carried tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, and the countless millions of tons of material essential to modern mechanized warfare. German U-boats sent Allied merchant vessels to the bottom by the hundreds, yet American shipbuilding replaced losses quicker than submarines could inflict them. Admiral Karl Dönitz watched his strategy of strangling Britain through starvation collapse beneath the weight of American shipbuilding output. American production capacity extended into every conceivable category of military equipment. By 1944, the American war machine had become staggering in its output. 2/3 of all Allied military equipment flowed from American factories. The numbers themselves seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Nearly 300,000 aircraft rolled off production lines, almost 200,000 artillery pieces, more than 86,000 tanks, roughly 2 million trucks. By the time the war ended, more than half of all industrial production happening anywhere in the world occurred right here in the United States. The sheer scale of American manufacturing capability left German commanders stunned. Those who faced American firepower firsthand understood immediately what the statistics meant. Field Marshal Rommel wrote to his wife during the brutal fighting at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, describing what he witnessed. American artillery controlled the entire battlefield, he noted. Observation planes directed fire from numerous batteries against every worthwhile target across the entire zone. German generals who studied American tactics kept arriving at the same unsettling conclusion. American artillery outmatched them in every single way. It was more mobile than theirs, fired larger shells, reached farther distances, and had ammunition supplies that seemed almost unlimited by comparison. Everything changed when proximity fuses arrived. These secret weapons used miniature radar to detonate shells at precisely the right height above the ground. The result was devastation beyond anything German soldiers had experienced. Infantry and unarmored vehicles simply couldn't survive this kind of bombardment. German troops learned to fear American artillery more than almost any other weapon on the battlefield. It became the sound of death itself. The real advantage wasn't just technology, though. It was volume. American factories produced shells at rates that made German gunners shake their heads in disbelief. They couldn't possibly match that rate of fire. They didn't have the factories, they didn't have the materials, they didn't have the workers. American soldiers carried the M1 Garand rifle, a semi-automatic weapon that changed everything about how infantry combat worked. German soldiers still carried bolt-action K98K Mausers. To fire again, they had to work a bolt. Americans pulled the trigger repeatedly without stopping. German units tried to compensate by giving soldiers more machine guns and submachine guns, but it wasn't the same thing. Individual American riflemen could maintain fire at rates German soldiers simply couldn't match with their bolt-action weapons. General George Patton looked at the M1 Garand and called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. That wasn't just talk, he meant it. Nazi ideology had told a different story about all this. American industrial capacity was supposedly exaggerated propaganda. The workers were supposedly too soft, too undisciplined. They supposedly lacked the racial and cultural superiority that made German workers superior. Jewish influence and racial mixing had supposedly corrupted American society beyond any military effectiveness. The ideology was certain about all of this. Every single one of these assumptions turned out to be catastrophically wrong. American democracy, for all its messiness and constant arguing, proved far more resilient and adaptable than German dictatorship. The mass production techniques American companies had developed, making refrigerators and automobiles, translated perfectly to making weapons. The diversity that Nazi ideology viewed as fatal weakness became strength that Germany couldn't even understand, much less match. The proof was written in the lives and sacrifices of Americans themselves. The people Hitler dismissed as racially inferior demonstrated capabilities that shattered Nazi racial theories completely. African American soldiers showed their courage and competence across every European battlefield. They proved through action what the ideology insisted was impossible. The Tuskegee Airmen represented one of the most stunning examples. From 1941 to 1946, 992 pilots trained in the program. 450 of them deployed overseas and flew 1,578 combat missions. Over 15,000 combat sorties total. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in actual air combat. Another 150 on the ground. They damaged 148 more. Nazi propaganda had portrayed black Americans as fundamentally incapable of mastering complex machinery or displaying genuine military courage. Every single word of that was a lie exposed by reality. What made their record even more remarkable was what happened to the bombers they protected. They escorted heavy bombers on dangerous missions deep into enemy territory. 27 bombers were lost during these escort missions. Other P-51 groups averaged losing 46 bombers under similar circumstances. The Tuskegee Airmen had the lowest loss rate of any escort fighter group in the entire theater. Bomber crews specifically requested them as escorts. They knew these black pilots would bring them home. The unit earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. They received 14 Bronze Stars and 744 Air Medals. 21 Tuskegee Airmen received the Distinguished Flying Cross. 3 were killed in action. 3 became prisoners of war. These were the men Nazi racial ideology insisted were incapable of mastering complex machinery. On the ground, the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, attached themselves to General Patton's Third Army in October 1944. They fought 183 consecutive days in combat without relief. They participated in 4 major Allied campaigns. They breached the Siegfried Line, liberated over 30 towns, and were among the first American units to shake hands with Soviet forces in Austria. They suffered nearly 50% casualties while inflicting an estimated 130,000 casualties on German forces. The battalion earned 1 Medal of Honor, though it took until 1997 for the award to be officially recognized. They received 11 Silver Stars and roughly 300 Purple Hearts. They earned a Presidential Unit Citation, though that award came in 1978, 33 years after the war ended. Patton had expressed racist views earlier in his career, but he came to respect the Black Panthers' fighting ability. He relied on them in critical operations. He understood what mattered on the battlefield, and what mattered was that these soldiers could fight. The 92nd Infantry Division was the only African-American infantry division fighting in European combat. About 15,000 officers and men served in Italy from October 1944 through May 1945. They suffered roughly 3,000 casualties. Over 400 were killed. About 1,500 were wounded. Another 500 were missing or became prisoners of war. They earned 2 Medals of Honor, both awarded in 1997, 5 decades after the fighting ended. They received 208 Silver Stars, 1,166 Bronze Stars, and 1,191 Purple Hearts. They liberated the Italian cities of La Spezia and Genoa. They fought with the same courage and tenacity that matched any unit in the American Army. One of the most critical, yet least celebrated contributions to Allied victory came from truck drivers. The Red Ball Express was a convoy system that kept supplies flowing to rapidly advancing front lines. About 75% of the drivers were African American, roughly 23,000 personnel total. From August 25 through November 16, 1944, they transported 412,193 tons of supplies across 82 days. They hauled everything from the beaches at Normandy to soldiers fighting miles ahead of established supply lines. At peak operation, 6,000 trucks moved 12,500 tons every single day. Drivers worked in shifts around the clock. They drove exhausted. They drove through rain. They drove through darkness. They kept the momentum going because stopping meant American soldiers would run out of food, ammunition, and fuel. General Patton called the 2.5-ton truck the most valuable weapon he had. He said that openly. His rapid advance across France depended entirely on that supply lifeline. Without the predominantly black drivers of the Red Ball Express, His tanks would have run out of fuel and ammunition within days. The entire campaign would have stalled. Roughly 1 million to 1.2 million African Americans served in the armed forces during the war out of 2.5 million registered for the draft. About 1 million served in the United States Army, another 167,000 in the Navy, 17,000 in the Marine Corps. 4,000 African American women served in the WACC. All of them served in a segregated military. All of them faced discrimination and prejudice. All of them served their country anyway. They served with distinction and courage. They proved through their actions what Nazi racial ideology denied with words. They were not inferior. They were not incapable. They were Americans who loved their country and fought to defend it, even when that country didn't yet grant them full equality. The atomic bomb represented the ultimate irony of Nazi racial policy. Jewish scientists fleeing Hitler's persecution built the most devastating weapon in human history. The Manhattan Project's roster reads like a catalogue of refugees from Nazi racial policies. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed the entire project. Leo Szilard co-authored Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt and conducted the first controlled nuclear chain reaction with Enrico Fermi. Albert Einstein's theories provided the theoretical foundation for everything that followed. Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, John von Neumann, Felix Bloch, Otto Frisch, Rudolf Peierls, Eugene Wigner, and Richard Feynman were among dozens of Jewish scientists. Hitler's ideology had classified them as subhuman parasites corrupting German society. Hitler had forced them into exile. These men, whom the Nazi regime had rejected, developed the weapon that would make American victory absolute. The vast majority of the Manhattan Project's scientists were Jewish. Almost all of them were German, Hungarian, or Austrian refugees fleeing Nazi racial policies. Nazi ideology had literally driven the scientific talent that would create the war's most decisive weapon directly into American hands. Hitler's racial theories had created his own worst nightmare: a Jewish scientific brain trust working for America. Nazi Germany expelled the scientists who might have given them atomic weapons first. Those same scientists, welcomed by America's pluralistic society, built the bomb that ensured Hitler's regime would be utterly destroyed. Ideology divorced from reality had led Germany to arm its greatest enemy with its most talented minds. Battlefield communications created another stunning advantage. Native American code talkers provided unbreakable communications that baffled Japanese intelligence throughout the entire war. About 400 to 420 Navajo Marines developed and used a code based on their native language. Japanese cryptographers, among the world's finest, never broke the Navajo code despite intensive efforts. They couldn't even figure out what language was being spoken. At Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo code talkers sent and received over 800 messages during the first 2 days of fighting. Not a single error. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer at Iwo Jima, stated years later that without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Beyond just the Navajo Marines, approximately 534 Native Americans from 14 to 15 different tribes served as code talkers in both European and Pacific theaters. 14 Comanche code talkers served in Europe and participated in the Normandy invasion. They provided secure communications during the Utah beach landing and the operations that followed. They transmitted messages about German positions, troop movements, and tactical situations that couldn't be intercepted and decoded. The supposedly racially inferior Native Americans had created a communication system that the most sophisticated enemy intelligence couldn't crack. Japanese-American soldiers proved their loyalty and courage despite the injustice of internment camps that imprisoned their families back home. The 422nd Regimental Combat Team, composed entirely of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in United States military history. The official Army designation stands as testimony to their achievements. The statistics tell the real story. They earned 21 medals of honor. 20 of those were upgraded in 2001, though the original 20 were awarded during the actual war. They received 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, and 9,486 Purple Hearts. Over 18,000 individual decorations total from a unit that began with just 4,000 men. The 442nd suffered a casualty rate of 314%. The unit had to be replaced more than 3 times over just to keep fighting. From an original strength of 4,000 men, between 14,000 and 18,000 individuals served in the 442nd during the war. More than 680 were killed in action. The rescue of the lost battalion in October 1944 exemplified their sacrifice and courage. 211 soldiers from the 141st Regiment of the 36th Texas Division found themselves surrounded in the Vosges Mountains. The 442nd was ordered to break through German lines and get them out. From October 26th through October 30th, 1944, the operation lasted 5 days. The 442nd suffered over 800 casualties trying to rescue 201 trapped men. More than 140 were killed, over 600 were wounded. Company K was reduced to just 17 riflemen. Company I was reduced to just 8 riflemen. The unit received 5 Presidential Unit citations in 20 days for actions that were designated as one of the top 10 battles in United States Army history. These Japanese-American soldiers fought with extraordinary courage, while their families were imprisoned behind barbed wire in internment camps in the American West. They fought not because they were treated fairly. They fought because they loved their country and wanted to prove their loyalty. Nazi racial ideology insisted that racial mixing and diversity made nations weak. The 442nd proved that loyalty and courage have nothing to do with racial purity. Hispanic Americans served in numbers that far exceeded their percentage of the total population. An estimated 400,000 to 500,000 Hispanic Americans served in the military. Company 1 of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Division, was an entirely Mexican-American unit from El Paso, Texas. They were among the first American troops to land in Italy at Salerno. During the disastrous Rapido River crossing on January 20th to 22nd, 1944, the unit paid a terrible price. Of 154 men who crossed the river, only 27 returned. The unit was virtually destroyed at one of the war's most costly river crossings. Those who survived continued fighting at Monte Cassino and throughout the brutal Italian campaign. They demonstrated courage and tenacity that matched any unit in the American Army. Women transformed American war production from something supposedly impossible to something that actually happened. The female workforce increased from 27% in 1940 to between 36 and 37% by 1945. About 6 million women entered the workforce during the war years. In aircraft manufacturing, women comprised 65% of the industry workforce by 1943. Before the war, women had represented just 1%. At the Willow Run B-24 bomber plant alone, up to 1/3 of the 42,000-person workforce were women. More than 15,000 female workers built the bombers that pounded German positions in Normandy and across occupied Europe. These women learned complex industrial skills that had never been expected of them. They operated heavy machinery, they read technical blueprints, they maintained quality control on weapons systems that required precision manufacturing. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic symbol, but she represented real women with real skills doing essential work. They welded steel, they assembled engines, they installed electrical systems. They tested aircraft. They worked in shipyards building Liberty ships and destroyers. They manufactured ammunition. They assembled rifles. They packed parachutes. Without women workers, American industrial production could never have reached the levels that overwhelmed German capacity. American production did more than just equip American forces. Through the Lend-Lease program, America became the arsenal of democracy for all Allied nations. The scale of American aid to Britain and the Soviet Union demonstrated industrial capacity that German planners had insisted was impossible. Britain received over $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid. In current value, that's roughly $540 billion. This included aircraft, tanks, trucks, food, raw materials, and industrial equipment. Without American supplies, Britain couldn't have continued fighting after 1941. The Royal Air Force flew American-built aircraft. British soldiers drove American trucks. British civilians ate food shipped from America. British factories processed American raw materials into finished weapons. The Soviet Union received over $11 billion in Lend-Lease aid. That's equivalent to roughly $190 billion today. The shipments included 409,000 trucks and jeeps, 12,000 armored vehicles, including 7,000 tanks, 11,000 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food. That was enough to provide half a pound of food daily to every Soviet soldier for the entire duration of the war. 15 million pairs of boots, 13 million winter coats. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the final assault on Berlin, acknowledged after the war that without American trucks, the Red Army wouldn't have had anything to pull artillery with. The Soviet Union's mobility during its great offensives from 1943 to 1945 depended heavily on American Studebaker trucks. Soviet factories focused on producing tanks and artillery, while American industry provided the transportation and logistics support that made everything else possible. American industrial production supported not just American forces, but the entire Allied war effort. Stalin himself, despite his complicated relationship with the West, admitted in a 1943 toast that without American production, the Allies would have lost the war. Even allowing for diplomatic exaggeration, the fundamental point remained absolutely valid. American industrial capacity was sustaining three major Allied powers simultaneously, while also fighting a two-front war against Germany and Japan. German intelligence officers knew these numbers. They read reports of American production statistics. They tracked Lend-Lease shipments. But Nazi ideology provided a framework that reinterpreted the evidence in ways that made sense to Nazi thinking. The numbers must be exaggerated, they reasoned. American production was supposedly inferior in quality. Allied unity would crack under pressure. The capitalist democracies and the communist Soviet Union would eventually turn on each other. Every single assumption proved wrong. American production numbers weren't exaggerated, but actually understated in some categories. American equipment quality was generally excellent, often superior to German equivalents in reliability and ease of production. Allied unity held together despite tensions because all three major powers recognized that defeating Nazi Germany was essential to their survival. The supposedly impossible feat of supplying multiple Allied nations while fielding massive American forces was accomplished through systematic industrial organization and logistical planning that German authorities had believed no messy democracy could possibly achieve. The German intelligence failure extended beyond the immediate invasion preparations. Throughout 1943 and 1944, German military intelligence received accurate reports of American production capacity and force buildup in Britain. The invasion preparations were visible, the numbers were available, the evidence was clear. But at every level of command, Nazi ideology filtered how the intelligence was interpreted. Reports of American production were dismissed as Allied propaganda, designed to intimidate Germany into surrender. When intelligence officers reported that America produced nearly 30,000 tanks in 1943 alone, senior commanders refused to believe it. That number exceeded total German production for the entire war. The ideology wouldn't allow the evidence to penetrate. The senior German commanders dismissed it out of hand. Surely this was propaganda, they argued, or perhaps just training equipment and old models. There was no way this could represent genuine combat-ready fighting power. When reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs showing Liberty ships crammed into American harbors, row after row of them stretching across the docks, the images were studied carefully, but the meaning was ignored. Yes, the Americans could build ships, the reasoning went, but they must be shoddy work. Ships built that quickly would come apart in the first serious storm. German naval intelligence disagreed. They'd tested captured American equipment themselves and knew better. Yet ideology proved stronger than facts when decisions got made at the highest levels. The Abwehr, Germany's intelligence service, actually produced solid work throughout the war, often accurate intelligence that could have helped. But Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, running the Abwehr, had grown increasingly skeptical of Nazi leadership himself. When his intelligence contradicted what the Nazi leadership assumed about enemy strength, the reports got shelved. By 1944, genuinely useful intelligence that could have helped Germany counter Allied moves more effectively was simply ignored or twisted to fit what the leadership wanted to believe. This wasn't unique to Nazi Germany, but the price Germany paid was catastrophic. When your entire worldview says that racially mixed democracies can't fight effectively, and then the evidence shows them mobilizing industrial and military power on an unimaginable scale, you face a fundamental choice. You can acknowledge the evidence and rethink your beliefs, or you can reject what you're seeing and cling to what you already think. The Nazi leadership always picked the second option, and that choice cost them everything. Nazi racial ideology preached that mixing races meant weakness, that racially pure soldiers outperformed everyone else, that Jewish people corrupted nations, that women had no place outside the home. American reality shattered every single one of these claims. The very diversity the Nazis ridiculed became an advantage that a monolithic, racially pure Germany simply could never achieve. Japanese Americans fluent in Japanese worked in military intelligence, translating documents and intercepted radio traffic. Navajo Marines created communication systems the enemy could never crack. Jewish scientists who'd fled Europe built atomic weapons. African-American soldiers drove supply convoys carrying fuel and ammunition to keep the army moving. Women operated the factories producing aircraft and ships that gave the Allies control of the skies and seas. Hispanic Americans bled in the mountains of Italy. Native Americans transmitted battlefield orders through codes the Germans couldn't break. America's society, built on different peoples and perspectives, could mobilize human talent in ways Germany's racial ideology made absolutely impossible. Every principle of Nazi racial theory translated into military weakness. Every belief about diversity as a liability turned out devastatingly wrong. A nation Hitler had dismissed as mongrelized and weakened had become an industrial and military powerhouse Germany couldn't begin to match. Long before the beaches of Normandy, German defenders already knew the weight of American industrial might. Starting in 1943, American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators hammered German cities and factories in daylight while British bombers came at night. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, had grown from just a handful of bombers in 1942 into a massive force of over 200,000 personnel and thousands of heavy bombers by 1944. On major operations, the 8th could send more than 1,000 heavy bombers into the air, protected by hundreds of P-51 Mustang fighters. Each bomber carried 8,000 pounds of ordnance. A single raid with 1,000 bombers dropped 8 million pounds of explosives on German targets in one mission. German factory workers and soldiers felt this American air power firsthand, as their industrial centers were systematically destroyed. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the aircraft plants at Regensburg, the synthetic oil refineries Germany desperately needed to keep fighting. Mission after mission, month after month, American bombers and their crews paid in blood. But the cumulative damage to German production was staggering. By spring 1944, German soldiers standing in Normandy bunkers could look up and watch American bombers passing overhead in long formations heading toward Germany. Hundreds of aircraft moving in tight groups, tiny silver shapes against the blue sky, carrying tons of explosives to German soil. Those bombers represented the same production capacity that was about to deliver an invasion force bigger than history had ever seen. The Luftwaffe, which once controlled European skies, had been worn down through constant attrition. Experienced fighter pilots died faster than Germany could train replacements. Fuel shortages meant many aircraft never left the ground. Production couldn't match the losses. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe had become a remnant of what it once was. Unable to challenge Allied control of the air over France, the German defenders in Normandy understood exactly what Allied air superiority meant. They'd seen it happen in North Africa when Rommel's army got pounded from above. They'd watched it in Italy as fighter bombers destroyed German supply lines. They were living it themselves as Allied aircraft hunted freely across France, striking anything that moved. The Allies owned the sky. Everyone knew it. By spring 1944, the real question wasn't if the Allies would attack France, but when and where they would land. German intelligence understood an invasion was coming. Rommel and von Rundstedt had different ideas about defense strategy, but they agreed on one thing: stopping the invasion right at the waterline was absolutely essential. If the Allies broke through and got established on French soil, Germany didn't have the forces to throw them back. Rommel pushed for panzer divisions stationed near the beaches to attack immediately when the invasion began. Von Rundstedt wanted to keep armor in reserve, ready to hit hard only after the invasion site was clear. Both approaches might have worked if Germany controlled the skies and could move freely. But Rommel saw what von Rundstedt hadn't quite grasped yet. Allied air supremacy would make moving large tank formations a death sentence. In his report before the invasion, Rommel wrote words that proved prophetic about what air power could do. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. This wasn't doubt, but hard-won knowledge. Rommel had experienced Allied air power in North Africa and knew what awaited him. On June 5, 1944, weather forecasters predicted 2 weeks of terrible conditions. High winds, violent seas, and thick clouds would prevent any large-scale amphibious operation from succeeding. Rommel, thinking the weather meant the beaches were safe, drove back to Germany to join his wife Lucy for her 50th birthday on June 6. Senior German officers let their guard down, confident the invasion couldn't possibly come yet. German intelligence intercepted Allied radio messages on June 1 and June 5. The opening lines of a Verlaine poem had been identified by Admiral Canaris as the signal for invasion coming within 2 days. Lieutenant Colonel Meyer notified the 15th Army, called Rommel's headquarters, and sent urgent messages to General Jodl. The chain of communication fell apart. Jodl received the warning but did nothing, assuming von Rundstedt had already acted. Von Rundstedt got the information but took no action, assuming Rommel was handling it. Rommel either never got the alert or didn't take it seriously because of his wife's birthday. The 15th Army went on higher alert but didn't move significantly. Other units never received proper notification. The one German force with dead-accurate intelligence about immediate invasion couldn't prevent disaster because each commander assumed someone else was taking care of it. However, Allied weather specialists had spotted a narrow window of barely acceptable conditions on June 6. General Dwight Eisenhower gave the order to proceed. The invasion would happen. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, more than 23,000 Allied paratroopers descended into Normandy by parachute or glider. American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped over the Cottontown Peninsula behind Utah Beach. British and Canadian paratroopers from the 6th Airborne seized the eastern side of the landing area near Caen. They had to capture bridges, destroy gun emplacements, and prevent German reinforcements from arriving quickly. The drops were scattered chaos. Violent winds and German anti-aircraft shells spread paratroopers across miles of Norman countryside. Some landed in water-filled fields and drowned beneath their heavy packs. Others came down miles away from where they were supposed to and had to find their way through enemy territory in total darkness. Still, scattered groups of paratroopers managed to accomplish critical tasks, taking bridges, blocking roads that could have funneled German reinforcements to the beaches. At 05:45, still full dark, the naval bombardment started. 84 warships and numerous landing craft carrying guns and rockets opened fire on the German defenses. The noise was almost unbearable, a constant avalanche of explosions lighting up the darkness and shaking the earth itself. USS Nevada, repaired after Pearl Harbor and back in service, fired 337 rounds of 14-inch shells and nearly 2,700 rounds from its 5-inch guns at Utah Beach alone. HMS Belfast would fire over 4,600 shells over the next month of operations. HMS Ramillies fired more than 1,000 rounds from its main 15-inch guns by June 18th. German defenders in their concrete positions experienced bombardment beyond anything they'd known. Bunkers shook and fractured. Communication lines were cut to pieces. Fighting positions were erased. At 06:30, the first assault troops came ashore. Over 132,000 seaborne soldiers would hit 5 beaches that day. Americans attacked Utah Beach on the Cottontan Peninsula and Omaha Beach, between Vierville and Collierville. The British assaulted Gold and Sword beaches. The Canadians landed on Juno Beach. Each one presented unique difficulties and varying German resistance. Utah Beach turned out to be the least costly. Strong ocean currents pushed landing craft 2,000 yards south of where they were aimed, which accidentally steered them past the heaviest German defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., President Theodore Roosevelt's son, and at 56, the most senior officer landing with assault troops, led the 4th Infantry Division ashore. When he saw they'd landed in the wrong spot, he declared with famous words, "We'll start the war right here." Utah Beach saw fewer than 200 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing from over 23,000 who landed. The mistaken landing site, combined with strong naval gunfire and rapid advances from the beach, let American forces quickly join up with paratroopers inland and secure the western edge of the invasion. Omaha Beach became the worst and most brutal landing. German positions at Omaha were stronger than anyone expected. The 352nd Infantry Division, a better trained unit than most coastal defenders, held the line. Tall cliffs above the beach gave German gunners perfect fields of fire. High seas swamped many landing craft and tanks trying to swim ashore. The first waves at Omaha took murderous fire. German machine guns and artillery swept the beach, soldiers huddled behind obstacles and the concrete wall, unable to move forward. More landing craft kept bringing men into a slaughter. For hours, it looked like the Omaha assault could collapse completely. Officers on the ships considered pulling survivors off and sending fresh waves to other beaches. Then small bands of American soldiers, led by sergeants and junior officers, started pushing up the cliffs. Combat engineers destroyed obstacles even as German fire cut them down. Naval destroyers pushed close to shore, sometimes driving themselves onto sand to deliver point-blank fire. Inch by inch, yard by yard, American troops fought their way off Omaha's beach and took the high ground above it. When the day ended, about 2,400 Americans had been killed or wounded at Omaha, but the beach was held. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches faced different amounts of opposition. Gold saw experienced British troops overcome determined resistance. Juno presented nasty conditions with reefs and strong defenses, but Canadian forces pushed inland rapidly. Sword, nearest to Caen, encountered tough German fighting, but British soldiers got a solid position established. Allied air power that day was overwhelming and completely unchallenged. The Allies had 11,590 aircraft ready, including 3,455 heavy bombers, almost 1,000 medium and light bombers, and 3,824 fighters. These aircraft flew nearly 15,000 sorties that single day. By comparison, the Luftwaffe had between 319 and 815 serviceable aircraft in all of Western France. The difference was roughly 37 Allied sorties for every one German flight. German pilots who tried to stop the invasion were instantly surrounded by Allied fighters. Ace pilot Joseph Priller made a famous single attack, run across Sword Beach with his wingman, literally the only German air attack on the beaches the entire day. 2 aircraft against almost 12,000. German defenders watched the sky fill with Allied planes, in formations stretching across the entire horizon. Their positions got torn apart by diving bombers. Reinforcements on roads leading to the fighting got strafed and destroyed. They lived through what Rommel had predicted. Fighting modern weapons against an enemy controlling the air meant fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, like medieval warriors facing modern soldiers. The invasion fleet totaled 6,939 vessels. This included over 1,000 naval warships, over 4,000 landing ships and landing craft, 736 support vessels, and 864 cargo ships. Nearly 200,000 sailors from Allied nations crewed these ships. By nightfall on D-Day, between 156,000 and 160,000 Allied soldiers had established themselves in Normandy. 73,000 Americans and over 83,000 British and Canadians. The German defenders stood in shock. They had been crushed by an invasion of such overwhelming scale and meticulous coordination that Nazi ideology had flatly declared impossible. Across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Germany maintained 58 divisions nominally. Roughly 850,000 troops stretched thin across 2,000 miles of vulnerable coastline. Yet the reality on the ground told a different story. Quality varied wildly from unit to unit. Many divisions were static formations without proper transport or mobility. Nearly half consisted of Ostbataillonen, hastily assembled units of dubious fighting quality, formed from Soviet prisoners of war who had been pressed into German military service against their will. These were not the hardened panzer and motorized infantry divisions that had swept across France with such devastating effectiveness in 1940. General Erich Marx commanded El Kazuach Corps, the formation directly responsible for defending all 5 invasion beaches. He had only 3 divisions under his command, and 2 of them were static units without the mobility for rapid response. When the invasion exploded across the beaches, Marx grasped instantly what was at stake: the entire war. He issued orders to Colonel Hermann von Opel-Bronichowski with unmistakable urgency. The colonel would lead the 21st Panzer Division in a desperate counterattack. Marx's words carried the weight of finality. If you fail to drive the British back into the sea, Germany has lost this war. The 21st Panzer Division became Germany's only significant armoured counterattack, launched on D-Day itself. The tanks reached the Channel coast around 8 in the evening, pushing between Juno and Sword beaches. For one brief critical moment, German panzers had achieved their objective. But success without follow-through meant nothing. The division had no infantry reserves close enough to exploit the breakthrough. No reinforcements arrived to hold the gained ground. Above and around them, overwhelming Allied naval firepower descended upon any German movement, punishing vehicles and troops with relentless bombardment. Then the sky filled with something worse. 250 Allied gliders materialized overhead, descending toward German rear areas with paratroopers ready for combat. The threat to his flanks and supply lines forced Marx to order withdrawal by 9 o'clock that night. The window of opportunity had slammed shut. Hitler had slept through the morning of June 6, remaining undisturbed in his headquarters. The crucial panzer reserves remained locked away, unavailable to commanders desperately needing them. They were not released until 3 in the afternoon. A catastrophic 12-hour delay that permitted Allied forces to dig in, consolidate their positions, and transform temporary beachheads into permanent footholds. The fractured command structure that both Rommel and von Rundstedt had warned against proved fatal to German coordination. When General Hans Speidel, serving as Chief of Staff, telephoned Rommel with reports of massive Allied landings spreading across multiple beaches, Rommel repeated the same phrase over and over as he rushed back toward Normandy. "How stupid of me! How stupid of me!" The words reflected his dawning comprehension of disaster. He arrived at La Roche-Guyon headquarters around 10 o'clock that evening. By then, 156,000 Allied troops had already crossed the Channel and established themselves on the beaches. The moment for preventing the invasion had evaporated into history. By month's end, the statistics painted a grim picture for German commanders. 850,000 Allied troops had now crossed the Channel. 570,000 tons of supplies landed on the beaches. 150,000 vehicles rolled inland. The Germans found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and rendered helpless by Allied dominance in both air and sea. Their situation spiraled from bad to worse with each passing day. On June 20th, Field Marshal von Rundstedt completed his formal assessment, 3,100 words of brutal, unflinching honesty about what had gone wrong. He identified the decisive factor with no ambiguity. Enemy air superiority had made German defensive doctrine completely obsolete. Their entire strategic framework for defending the coast had become worthless in the face of overwhelming Allied air power. Von Rundstedt's report documented the scope of that air dominance with cold precision. Allied aircraft flew 29,000 sorties in just 2.5 days. Fighters and dive bombers operated as far as 65 miles behind German lines. Roughly 2,300 aircraft operated daily, attacking every conceivable target. Supply columns, armor formations, even individual soldiers caught in the open. Naval gunfire made the situation even more desperate. German tanks attempting to move during daylight hours across open terrain faced certain destruction. The enemy's tactical bombers carried the battle directly into German rear areas, interrupting supply lines, destroying reinforcements, turning motorized columns into burning wreckage that blocked roads and prevented the movement of fresh troops and ammunition. Supply and replacement had transformed from logistical challenges into near-impossible problems. Von Rundstedt's frustration reached a breaking point by June 29th, when Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel contacted him, asking what could possibly be done. Von Rundstedt responded with shocking directness that cut through all pretense and military courtesy. "Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do?" There was nothing else. The situation was beyond repair. Official explanations cited age and ill health when von Rundstedt was dismissed on July 4th. The actual reason was more fundamental. He had recognized what Hitler refused to acknowledge. The war in Western Europe had already been lost. Germany no longer possessed the military capacity to defeat the forces arrayed against it across the Channel. No strategic brilliance or tactical innovation could overcome material reality. In the weeks and months following D-Day, German military commanders continued submitting reports documenting their catastrophic predicament. General Erich Marx, who had held the critical command of LX's One Corps, facing all 5 invasion beaches, was killed on June 12th by Allied air attack. He received oak leaves to his Knight's Cross posthumously for his efforts in containing the invasion during those vital first days. Though containing might have been too generous a description for desperate defensive battles that merely delayed inevitable Allied victory. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel attempted to persuade Hitler that continuation of the war made no strategic sense. The situation on the Normandy front deteriorated daily, moving inexorably toward catastrophe. Rommel sent Hitler a personal letter on July 15th with stark language. "The situation is growing worse every day and is rapidly approaching a crisis. The unequal struggle approaches its end." There remained no realistic path to German victory. 2 days later, on July 17th, Rommel's staff car was attacked by an Allied fighter pilot. The strafing run left him with severe head injuries that ended his active military career. Later, implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler, Rommel was given an ultimatum on October 14, 1944. He was forced to take his own life, a betrayal by the regime he had served with distinction. The Desert Fox, who had recognized American military capabilities early and whose tactical assessments proved consistently accurate, was destroyed by his own government. Von Rundstedt, dismissed in July for his peace proposal, was actually recalled as Commander-in-Chief West in September 1944. Hitler had few commanders with von Rundstedt's experience, and desperate times required experienced leadership regardless of ideological reliability. Von Rundstedt commanded during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive attempt in the West. It failed for precisely the same reasons that had doomed every German offensive since D-Day: insufficient fuel, minimal air support, and crushing Allied material superiority at every point. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, American industrial power had become undeniable even to the most zealous Nazi true believers. American, British, and Soviet forces occupied German territory. German cities lay in ruins, pulverized by years of relentless bombing campaigns. German industry had been systematically destroyed. The Wehrmacht was shattered into fragments. Everywhere German soldiers looked, they encountered American equipment in quantities that made German wartime production look almost insignificant by comparison. The transformation was profound. Hitler's January 1942 dismissal of America as half Judaized and half Negroid represented more than crude racism. By June 1944, von Rundstedt's assessment of complete enemy mastery acknowledged military defeat. The gap between these two statements revealed something darker than military miscalculation. It demonstrated how ideology detached from empirical reality produces catastrophic strategic failure. Nazi leaders genuinely believed their racial theories. They had convinced themselves that racial diversity weakened nations, that Jewish presence corrupted societies, that democracy made countries militarily weak, that mass consumer production could never translate into military weapons manufacturing. These were not cynical propaganda slogans calculated for public consumption. They were core convictions that shaped how German leadership understood the world and assessed their enemies. Evidence of American industrial capacity had been available throughout 1942 and 1943. Germany maintained excellent intelligence services that tracked production figures accurately. They knew the numbers showing American manufacturing capacity. Yet Nazi ideology functioned as a filter, reinterpreting all contradictory evidence. American production was dismissed as inferior quality, inadequate for serious warfare. American soldiers were portrayed as poorly motivated, lacking the ideological commitment of German forces. American society was characterized as fundamentally fractured and weak, unable to sustain unified military effort. Ideology acted as a lens that made contradictory evidence invisible or irrelevant. When uncomfortable facts appeared, they were reinterpreted to fit existing beliefs rather than forcing those beliefs to change. By June 6, 1944, reality could no longer be denied or reinterpreted away. When 156,000 troops landed from 6,939 ships under protection of 11,590 aircraft, when Allied naval guns made German tank movement suicidal, when Allied air superiority achieved ratios of 37-1 across the beaches, when American logistics transported 413,000 tons of supplies over 82 days, sustaining rapid advance across France. The gap between Nazi fantasy and empirical reality became impossible to bridge. Rommel's pre-invasion prediction had proven prophetically correct. Allied air superiority devastated panzers to fighter-bomber attacks exactly as he had warned, preventing their movement and destroying their concentration. The strategic debate between Rommel's armor positioned at the coast and von Rundstedt's reserves held inland became completely irrelevant once Allied air and naval power made large-scale German armored counterattacks impossible regardless of positioning. The final bitter irony completing the circle of German self-destruction involved Nazi racial policies themselves. Those policies directly strengthened America while weakening Germany simultaneously. Jewish scientists fleeing Nazi persecution had built the Manhattan Project that created atomic weapons. German military intelligence lost countless talented analysts and codebreakers through racial purges. The SS diverted scarce military resources toward genocide rather than combat effectiveness. Occupied territories that might have provided willing labor or even military recruits instead became centers of resistance and partisan warfare. Every principle underlying Nazi racial ideology translated directly into strategic disadvantage and military weakness. Hitler's dismissal of America was not random cruelty. It flowed logically from Nazi racial theory. That same theory predicted American industrial collapse, military incompetence, societal fragmentation, and inevitable defeat. American reality systematically disproved every prediction. The supposedly half-Judaized and half-Negroid nation Hitler dismissed in January 1942 had become by June 1944 the industrial and military power that German commanders now recognized could not be defeated. The beaches of Normandy became the graveyard of Nazi illusions. There, on sand and in surf, German defenders finally confronted the reality they had denied for so long. America was not weak, its society was not fractured irreparably. Its industrial power was not propaganda exaggeration, but terrifying actuality. Perhaps most importantly, the soldiers who came ashore that day came from every American state and dozens of ethnic backgrounds. They fought with courage and determination, rivaling anything German soldiers could muster. The German soldiers defending Normandy learned in the harshest way possible that propaganda is a poor foundation for strategy. The America they had been taught to despise and dismiss was actually a colossus. The racial diversity they had been told made America weak had made it formidable. The democracy they had been assured was chaotic and inefficient had proven itself capable of extraordinary organization and coordinated effort. The industrial capacity they had been promised was inflated, was, if anything, understated in intelligence reports that seemed too extreme to believe. D-Day was not the end of the war. 11 more months of brutal fighting remained before German surrender in May 1945. German soldiers continued fighting with considerable skill and courage, but the outcome was no longer uncertain. The industrial and military might arrayed against Germany was simply too overwhelming. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, Fortress Europe had been penetrated, and the armies that came ashore in Normandy would not stop until they met Soviet forces in Berlin's heart. Adolf Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of America as half Judaized and half Negroid stands as one of history's greatest miscalculations. Those words, spoken with such absolute confidence in January 1942, revealed the fatal flaw at Nazi ideology's core. The racial theories animating the Third Reich prevented German leadership from understanding that national strength flows from multiple sources: industrial capacity, technological innovation, social cohesion, moral purpose, and yes, diversity of talent and perspective. America possessed all these strengths. Nazi Germany, blinded by ideology, could not recognize them until far too late. For 3 years, from December 1941, when Hitler declared war on America, through June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Nazi leadership clung to the belief that America's supposed weaknesses would prevent meaningful European participation. Those 3 years allowed America to build the largest military force in its history, supported by the greatest industrial mobilization the world had ever witnessed. When that force finally arrived on Normandy's beaches, it brought a power that German propaganda had insisted was impossible. The shock German defenders experienced watching the Allied armada approach was the shock of reality colliding catastrophically with ideology. They had believed propaganda about American weakness. They had accepted the comfortable lie that racial superiority would guarantee victory. The thousands of ships and aircraft filling sea and sky that June morning represented truth they could no longer deny or reinterpret. Von Rundstedt's advice to make peace acknowledged the conclusion evidence had been screaming since American production ramped up in 1942. Nazi ideology had led Germany into war against an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. The supposedly weak and divided nation had mobilized power on a scale that dwarfed anything the Third Reich could match. The lessons extend far beyond World War II. Ideology divorced from reality, beliefs maintained despite contradictory evidence, strategy based on wishful thinking rather than honest assessment. These produce catastrophic failure regardless of how sincerely held the beliefs may be. Nazi racial theory was not merely morally abhorrent. It was strategically suicidal. It led German leadership to systematically underestimate enemies and overestimate their own capabilities. The Americans, British, and Canadians who landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, were not supermen. They were ordinary people from democratic societies who had mobilized industrial capacity, organized military forces, and found courage to cross the Channel into German defenses. They came from every background, ethnicity, and region. They proved through victory what Nazi ideology had denied. Diversity is strength. Democracy can fight and win total war. Free societies possess advantages dictatorships can never match. The German officers staring in disbelief at the Allied armada on June 6, 1944, were witnessing consequences of their leadership's delusions. They had been told for 3 years that America was weak, divided, and incapable of sustained military effort. They had been promised that German superiority would prevail. Instead, they faced an enemy who brought to battle material power that rendered German resistance ultimately futile. 3 years after Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of half Judaized and half Negroid America, his own commanders were advising him to make peace because the war was lost. The scale of American industrial and military power materialized in Normandy had proven every Nazi assumption catastrophically wrong. Ideology had met reality, and reality had won decisively. The story of Nazi Germany's fatal underestimation of America stands as an enduring warning to future generations. Believe your own propaganda at your peril. Ignore evidence contradicting your worldview at catastrophic cost. Underestimate enemies based on prejudice rather than realistic assessment, and you may find yourself staring in shock at a horizon filled with ships and aircraft proving everything you believed was wrong. The officers looking across the English Channel that June morning in 1944 learned that lesson in the harshest way possible, as their world and ideology crumbled before overwhelming American power.